civil society leader, Khatam al-Qassian, former US political officer in Afghanistan, author of 2 magnificent books on Afghanistan, Barnett Rubin, veteran, famous expert and writer on Afghanistan and the Afghan peace process, chaired by Andrew Weinstein. And finally, Senator Chris Murphy, in conversation with Andrew Bacevich, about how the Afghan war became an endless war and how do we prevent this happening again in future. So I hope that you will be able to attend all or at least some of these panels on Friday. Now, to move to today's panel, which is on the subject of the role of Afghanistan's region in Afghanistan's future, and obviously in relations with the United States and the West over Afghanistan. We have very distinguished panelists today from Afghanistan and from the region. Ibrahim Bahis is consultant for the International Crisis Group's Asia program and a leading member of Afghan civil society. Dr. Yun Sun is co-director of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center and a leading expert on China. My old friend and colleague of, 33 years, Zahid, I think, Zahid Hussain, distinguished veteran Pakistani journalist and commentator and author of a most apposite book, which is appearing in the United States very shortly, next month, I think, right, Zahid?
Yes, No Win War.
Called No Win War, the paradox of US-Pakistan relations in Afghanistan's shadow. And so no doubt Zahid will say something about his thesis of this book in his remarks today. And finally, Dr. Omar Samad, a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center, and formerly a leading senior Afghan diplomat, ambassador in Paris and in Canada, and who also formerly served as the head of the Afghan Foreign Ministry's Information Center. So welcome to you all. By the way, unfortunately, we didn't have the space or time for an expert on Russia, but if people are particularly interested in Russia's role, that is my chief hat at the Quincy, so I could say something about that as well. So to begin in order with Dr. Bahis, with the failure of the US and NATO effort in Afghanistan, how do you see the role of the region and regional countries in what will happen in Afghanistan in influencing Taliban behavior from the perspective of Afghan civil society today, and what challenges, opportunities, perhaps problems do you see in this regard?
Well, I have to start off by saying I'm not a civil society activist. Unfortunately, I will not be able to offer a lot of insights from that perspective. But in terms of the regional engagement, some of the broader issues I'm happy to speak with. I think let me start off by saying that up until now, we had seen a level of international consensus around how to deal with the Taliban. After the Doha Agreement, the UN Security Council passed a resolution endorsing that agreement, but also in there, it also mentioned that it does not welcome the return of the Taliban's Islamic Emirate. And that was a message we saw reiterated through the extended troika, where they said they will not welcome a government that comes by force, and they do not want a return of the Taliban's Islamic Emirate. But now that the Taliban has come to power by force, and now that they increasingly look like they will be declaring a return of the Islamic Emirate, we're beginning to see different lines of thinking and approaches on how to deal with this issue. I think the regional countries seem to have adopted a much more, their approach is that they can't really turn their eye away from the issue. It is a regional challenge. Instability in the country impacts the region, and it will inhibit not only economic growth, but could also impact the stability of the region. So there's a level of willingness to engage with the Taliban. Whether that translates to a formal recognition or not remains to be seen, but at least there's a willingness to engage at a working level in order to address some of the big challenges for the regional countries. I think when we look at the pronouncements of regional countries thus far, there's generally a level of hierarchy in terms of the priorities they have. I think the most clearest and most important core interest for most regional countries is ensuring that the Taliban uphold the counter-terrorism commitments they undertook as part of the Doha deal and prior and post that in various statements. But also we saw some signals, for example, from Russia stating that they will recognize a government that is inclusive. So I think there's a level of, we can't say counter-terrorism is the only issue regional countries are interested in, but they also want a more broad-based and perhaps a stable political order that would have ensure its longevity. If the Taliban do not bring an inclusive government, how does that impact that relationship? I think we can leave to a different question, but I think we are seeing a level of hierarchy in terms of how they're approaching the new political force in the country.
Thank you so much. Before I go on, I'd just like to say to the audience, any questions you have, please send to the Q&A site, and then I will read them to the panelists. So I hope you all have access to Q&A. Please do use it, because once we've gone around the panelists, I will throw it open to questions from the audience. Dr. Yun Sun, China has made the biggest commitment of foreign direct investment in Afghanistan on paper, in the Mezainak copper mine and in energy concessions in northern Afghanistan. So far, for very obvious reasons, in the middle of a civil war, it has done very little actually to implement or develop these sites. In future, how do you see China's policies towards Afghanistan developing? Is it a major part of Chinese thinking about Belt and Road? And is China going to wish to be much more closely involved in Afghanistan on the ground, or do you see a continuation of China's more cautious and hesitant attitude towards the country?
Thank you, Anatole. That's a great question. I think at least it depends on a few factors. So far, I would say Beijing's attitude towards the Taliban takeover has been, I would say, surprisingly positive, and is the reception and the recognition of Taliban's role, and also the definition coming from the Chinese official sources, definition of Taliban takeover as a win, as a victory for Afghan people. I think these are all quite surprising for the outside observers. But moving forward, I think China's attitude towards Afghanistan and Taliban or Taliban-led regime would depend on three factors. The first one is a swift, clean, and undisputed victory by Taliban. And so far, it seems that this condition is roughly matched from the Chinese perspective. The second condition is the Taliban's domestic and foreign policies. I think, like Russia, there are some reservations about whether Taliban's future policy will be inclusive, whether that regime is going to be as what Taliban has promised, at least on paper. And then in terms of foreign policy, I think the one thing that China attaches most importance is Taliban's relationship with the radical Islamic groups, especially those Uyghur groups that people believe are operating in, or at least present in, Afghanistan. And the third factor is how international community sees Taliban and treats Taliban, because China would not be the only one country extending recognition or building relationships. But so far, it seems that a number of countries, including Pakistan, Russia, Iran, and other Muslim countries, seems to have a relatively moderate attitude towards Taliban. So I think for China, one thing that China will try to avoid is being the only country or being the isolated figure in this engagement in Taliban. So those are the three factors, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Zahid, Pakistan, of course, has been especially entangled with Afghanistan over the years because chiefly of the Pashtun ethnicity, which spans both countries, the famous issue of the Durand Line. Pakistan is being widely blamed for having provided shelter to the Afghan Taliban. And the victory of the Afghan Taliban is being very widely seen as a success for Pakistani policy or strategy. Is that how you see it? And could you tell us something about how you see or you think that the Pakistani establishment sees the future of Afghanistan under the Taliban? What are the opportunities? What are the threats? And how does Afghanistan now fit into Pakistan's wider international agenda?
Thank you, Anatol. Yes, actually, it's a now historical fact that Taliban, after they were thrown out or ousted by American invasion, most of the Afghan leaders, Taliban leaders, took refuge in Pakistan, and from there they organized the resistance. It may not be a direct help from Pakistani military establishment for them, but certainly the sanctuary provided them an opportunity, and at least actually in the beginning, to reorganize themselves. And they have the support of Islamic Party. When they came to Pakistan after the war, they did not have any problem, as you said. Actually, both sides of the Durand Line, the same ethnic group lived there, and so they did not have any problem there. In fact, actually, even in the beginning, there was no pressure on Pakistan from the United States to take action against the Taliban leader. For Americans, the Taliban were history and defeated, and they were only interested in fighting Al Qaeda. So for 2 or 3 years, Pakistan did not have any pressure on them to take action on them. It all happened when the insurgency started picking up way back in 2006. Now, actually, the Taliban, the war in Afghanistan, had also remained the main source of tension between United States and Pakistan, although they have been in an alignment, a new alignment, which emerged after 2001 terrorist attacks. But there was a lot of paradox in that relationship. On the one side, Pakistani establishment cooperated with the Americans when it comes to Al Qaeda, but on Taliban and the strategy to fight Taliban in Afghanistan, there was a huge divide, and that has remained the major source of tension between the two. Now, what we've seen actually over the years, Pakistan from the very outset has been insisting on some kind of negotiated political settlement. And finally, it seems that America also realized that. So what we happened after Doha Agreement, it seems actually, I feel actually Doha Agreement itself was the beginning of Taliban group of Pakistan. It may be seen, it was not seen for many as a document of surrender. And what happened over the last few weeks is mind-boggling, and we all know actually that nobody expected the Taliban to return so far. Now, with Taliban now in full power, it has created mixed feeling in Pakistan. It's right actually that there's a tangible sense of devolution, not only among right-wing Pakistani Islamic group who sees the return of Taliban as victory for jihad, but even among those the corridors of power in Islamabad. Notwithstanding the euphoria, the Taliban's military success across the border is also ominous for Pakistan's national security. So there is also a feeling that it will give boost to the militancy in Pakistan. Pakistan has been fighting its own military for the last several years. They have managed to clear the former tribal area. But most of the what we call Pakistani Taliban had taken refuge across the border in Afghanistan. And they have actually close links with Afghan Taliban. So there is also apprehension that it will lead to increased the TTP activity inside Pakistan. And so far, Pakistan, despite Pakistan's insistence, there is no indication that the Taliban will take action against their Pakistani allies. And that's going to be a major problem. On the other hand, Pakistan has also decided not to unilaterally recognize the Taliban and will go along with the regional country. But on the other hand, they have also believed that the interaction with Taliban is necessary for not letting the fragmentation of Afghanistan that will lead to. So that is what the general feeling is.
Thank you so much, Zahid. Turning now to Dr. Samad, as a distinguished former Afghan diplomat, I wanted to ask how you see the issue of international recognition of the Taliban government or state of Afghanistan, and specifically, of course, on the part of Afghanistan's neighbors. Do you think this is something that should occur? How soon should it occur? What conditions should be set for such recognition? And also, how do you see the possibility of any degree of coordination over this between the United States and regional powers? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here in good company. The issue of recognition, obviously, is going to be a very immediate and urgent and thorny issue for all the stakeholders who have to take that into account, and at some point or another either decide to go ahead with recognition, what level of recognition, or not to go ahead, and then offer some justification. For the Taliban, it's also of vital importance. And I think when it comes to recognition, we have to sort of, unfortunately, divide the global or the international stakeholders into more than one category. You have, on one hand, the major stakeholders up to August 15, the ones who were paying the bills, the ones who were providing all the funds, most of the funds. In 70% of the country's budget was basically underwritten by mostly Western funds. They are somewhat out of the picture right now. They are trying at this moment to figure out how and under what conditions to re-engage and at what level, and the timing also matters. Then you have the region, the wider region. The wider region obviously includes countries that go as far as India and Turkey and Saudi Arabia. But the more important, I think, and for the Taliban too, are the neighbors of Afghanistan, the six neighbors. The six neighbors, I would say, plus Russia, because three of the Central Asian neighbors obviously are also coordinating some of their work through the Russians and to some extent with the Chinese. In that regard, I think the Taliban are very careful and want to make sure that they give the right messaging, the narratives that will not disturb their relationship that they have fostered over the past few years with almost all of them. They have fostered relations with Iran, with Russia, with China, and obviously have had relations with Pakistan for a long time. And the Central Asians obviously have also at times been involved in this. At this moment, two other countries are playing a technically critical role, as we can see. Both Turkey and Qatar, and to some extent the UAE wants to also play a role on the humanitarian side, have actually started to provide technical assistance to the Taliban through the reactivation of the Kabul International Airport. That is an interesting development, and it's expected that the Taliban in the next few days, when they announce the new government, will invite at least 5 or 6 nations to participate. Now, who is going to go, who's not going to go, is going to be interesting to see. Someone earlier alluded to the fact that the Russians and the Chinese see eye to eye on Afghanistan, with maybe some nuances. One of those nuances is the Russians would like to see a broad-based government, would like to see participation from major constituencies in Afghanistan. They have concerns about counterterrorism. They have concerns about drugs, so on and so forth. While the Chinese, I think, are more inclined to be interested in stability and not so much in how broad-based the government is or not. They want, obviously, they are also concerned, as was mentioned, about the terrorist threat that faces China and has had a presence in the past in Afghanistan at times through ETIM. In other outfits, the Uzbeks, for example, are worried about the IMU and so on and so forth. So I think each of these regional countries have a lot at stake, and they are not going to disengage as the Western nations so far have by freezing funds, by withholding World Bank, IMF assistance, and by putting pressure on the Taliban. Everything right now is sort of zeroed in on what the Taliban are going to do in terms of governance and in terms of the formation of the government. It's expected that they will announce something within the next few days. There are lots of rumors about the fact that they have internal discussions still ongoing, meaning that they may have differences of opinion within the Taliban movement itself. There are all types of pressures from other Afghan political stakeholders, regional stakeholders, international stakeholders. And I think that the biggest test over the next few days is going to be this issue of how the new government is going to be set up, who's going to be part of it, how is authority and power going to be divided, who's going to take care of what, and are they going to be qualified and educated elites as part of this new setup, including women, even though we know that the Taliban have said that at this point, they're not amenable to women in high-level decision-making ministerial positions, but let's see at what level they are. So I think all of this at this point is zeroing in on the next few days and the Taliban decisions that have to be taken.
Thank you so much. Now, moving to questions from the audience. The first question is from Gareth Smith. I have my own answer to this, but I'll leave it to the panelists. Is there a serious chance of the Taliban setting up an inclusive government? And if not, should external powers support a war to remove the Taliban from government? I suppose I could add to that an analytical question. Is there a chance that external powers or certain external powers will support a war to remove the Taliban? Who shall I begin with? Zahid, would you like to?
Well, I think Taliban perception or concept of inclusive government is very different than what the international community is asking for. It's not going to be have the representative of various Afghan groups of faction. What do they mean by inclusive? That they might take or induct in the government those people who had not been involved or had not the part of the organization, Taliban organization, and they are and belong to different ethnic groups. I think probably that's what they are going to do. I don't see any kind of national government coming to form. That's not going to happen. As far as whether there will be any effort to remove Taliban, I don't think it could happen. No one, even as regional countries, they have also has a huge stake, and they would not like the fragmentation or disintegration of Afghanistan, or a new civil war in Afghanistan for that matter, is going to have a very serious impact on the regional countries, and no one would really like Afghanistan to become kind of or a new civil war, which will almost lead to the fragmentation of the country.
And other panelists would agree with that analysis, or would anyone offer a dissenting opinion on that?
Not so much dissension, but I just wanted to add another point as well. I think in some ways we can say that the Taliban would like nothing more than to have ongoing war in the country. The Taliban is a quasi-military movement. It was bred out of war. It It has been at war for 27 years. I think it has never been in a state of complete peace where it has to focus on the mundane stuff of economic stability and service delivery. So I think in some ways that would be in some ways ideal for them to have that kind of situation, because that's what they know, how they're in their element in that kind of environment. But we'll have to wait and see whether that develops or not.
A question from O.D. Meyer, which also highlights the fact that, unfortunately, once again, for simply reasons of space and time, another important potential panelist is missing today. Can the panel share their views on the dynamics between Iran and the Taliban? Because there is a history of ambivalent relationship in the past. Ambivalent is a mild way, I think, of putting it. Perhaps Ambassador Samad, would you like to start by saying something about how you see the Iranian-Taliban relationship?
I'll give it a try. As you said, ambivalence is probably an understatement, because just in the past few days, we have seen a slight nuance shift in Tehran's narratives regarding Afghanistan and the Taliban. They initially were somewhat neutral, in the sense they were watching to see what happens. Then they were somewhat receptive and warm to the fact that there is a change that seems to be permanent in their view. And then as they saw a resistance take place in Panjshir Valley, and the issue become a little bit more ethnic and regional, then again yesterday, I think it was, their foreign ministry nuanced its narrative again by saying that they would like to see a different type of distanciation in Afghanistan, and that the continuation of this kind of effort is not good, and that others have the right to obviously have a say and say. So they gave a bit of a nudge to the resistance in Panjshir. I think that Iran's strategic objective has been accomplished in terms of the US NATO presence in Afghanistan. So that was the main driver of Iranian strategy in thinking vis-a-vis Afghanistan. The other issues that drive Iran have to do with, again, stability in Afghanistan, inclusivity, because Iranians obviously are very sensitive to the fact that the Shia community in Afghanistan has to be part of governance, that the Hazara community, minority groups, have to be protected, their rights have to be respected, that the jurisprudence of the Shia community through Jafariya school in jurisprudence has to be respected, which is something that, interestingly enough, the Taliban over the past year or two on different occasions have given their thumbs up to, meaning that they have agreed, they have given the green light to respect all of that. So that's important. But then obviously for Iran, there's the issue of IS, the Daesh threat, and other types of sectarian issues that exist with Pakistan that may also lurk into Afghanistan and seep into Afghanistan, as well as obviously the whole issue of Afghans leaving Afghanistan through Iran, the refugee crisis that has existed and continues, and the migrant crisis that has existed and continues. All of that are of issue. The last thing I would say is that Iran is also very much an economic player in the region. Iran and Afghanistan have a multi-billion-dollar trade. There's a lot of investment that has gone into Afghanistan, and Iran would like to see more of an economic footprint in Afghanistan in the future. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's keeping its options open with the Taliban.
Thank you. Could I ask a follow-up question to Dr. Yun Sun? Recent times have seen a considerable intensification in principle of relations between China and Iran. And I wondered how you see that developing, just how important this relationship is for China, and whether Chinese policy towards Afghanistan will be shaped to any significant degree by Iranian views. You need to unmute.
Sorry. Yes, like you said, China and China's relationship with Iran has seen some intensification in the past 2 years, I would say. Especially the 25-year comprehensive agreement between the two countries seems to have mapped out a blueprint for not only economic cooperation between the two countries, but also some level of strategic cooperation between Beijing and Tehran. And I think there are a lot of questions as for how that agreement will transpire and what kind of details will be included, because a lot within that bilateral relations, a lot of things are still depending on, for example, the U.S.-China relations, and also how U.S. interaction with Iran coming to a nuclear deal will eventually transpire. So there are some uncertainties associated with it. But I think it is safe to say that on the issue of Afghanistan, China is quite willing to coordinate and to negotiate with regional partners. But I think that the overall framework for that coordination also depends on the domestic situation in Afghanistan. Because if things really go well, we don't expect things will go well, but Beijing has very different perspective and criteria as for what domestic stability or what domestic policy would entail. So if Afghanistan goes in the direction that Beijing finds satisfactory, I think Beijing's most likely will be using not only regional and multilateral channels, but will also rely on bilateral channels to work its relationship with Afghanistan. I think the regional and what we call the multilateral regional frameworks that Beijing has been preparing for example, under the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, those are going to stay. But I think those are almost, from Beijing's perspective, looks like the damage control mechanism in case there is a further fallout in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, a question from Dr. Barnett Rubin. Since 2016, Russian presidential envoy on Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, has been working to create a consensus and policy coordination on Afghanistan among Russia, China, Iran, and Pakistan. Is that fragile consensus still operational, or is it strained or even unraveling today? So perhaps first from a Pakistani perspective, Zahid, how do you see Russian-Pakistani relations in a regional context over Afghanistan developing at present? Are they under increased strain as a result of Taliban victory?
I don't think there's under strain at the moment. They have been cooperating with each other, and Pakistan is a member of Troika Plus, which was initiated by this forum was initiated by Russia. And I think probably they have been in regular contact with each other. And I think probably at this point of time, there is some kind of regional consensus about how to deal with the Taliban government. There may be some variation in the approach, but all three countries, for example, Russia, China, and Pakistan, believe that while actually waiting for the formal recognition of the Taliban government, they also believe that there should be some kind of cooperation or contacts should be there with the Taliban, not to to push them to the corner. I think probably there is general agreement. I don't see any disagreement at this point of time. There may be actually some kind of differences on that road, but not on the overall policy.
Thank you. Would another panelist like to comment on this question of regional coordination shaped by Russia? Or do you agree with Zahid's view of that? Seems to make sense to me, I have to say. Now, several questions on the issue of US recognition. Should the US recognize the Taliban government? When should it? Under what conditions? And should the United States basically allow its own policy towards Afghanistan, question of recognition, to be shaped by the policies of regional countries? Dr. Bahis, do you have a view on this?
Thank you. I would say that the at the moment, at least if we take, we're not sure how the regional country will respond, but more broadly, if we go beyond that, I think in recognition of a Taliban-led government, along with development aid or investment, is seen as the key levers on how to nudge Taliban behavior and shape its behavior in some way or form. So those are precious and the last few remaining levers that many of these countries, including the US, has. And I don't think they will be willing to give up that leverage very easily. Right now, what we have seen so far is that many of the countries, including EU, US, UK, have indicated that they're willing to have continued humanitarian engagement in the country. They will continue to provide humanitarian aid to the country, provided the Taliban meet some minimum conditions. For example, what's stated is safe passage for humanitarian organizations to be able to come in and out of the country. But I also assume perhaps counterterrorism could also be in some ways linked with that, ensuring the Taliban adhere to that. But in terms of recognition, whether that will be provided, I think that very much relates to meeting some of the more norms-based demands that the international community is making. That includes protecting basic human rights, especially women and minorities. That includes having some kind of inclusive and representative government. And that perhaps also includes ensuring the Taliban have an ongoing counterterrorism footprint and are ensuring that they're meeting those commitments. I don't think any of the international countries are in a rush to recognize the Taliban's government. Already the US has withdrawn its diplomatic presence to Doha, so has many of the other countries. You are seeing officials still interacting with Taliban leaders on the ground, but that's very much outside the scope of a diplomatic or ambassadorial kind of level. So I don't think there's any rush on their behalf. If the regional communities, and again, I remain skeptical that the regional communities would somehow rush to recognize the Taliban's government, but in a scenario where regional countries, particularly powerful countries like China and Russia, start recognizing the government, I think it builds a bit of a momentum and it lessens the utility of international recognition for the international community. The last point I'll make is the international community overall generally seems to believe that they do not want to isolate the Afghanistan, and they do not want to have a repetition of the 1990s where the Taliban became dependent on where lack of interaction and recognition led to the Taliban becoming dependent on non-state actors, including Al-Qaeda, and also that the humanitarian crisis in the country could exacerbate, and that could lead to outflows of refugees and space for terror groups to find foothold in the country again. So there is a level of consensus that they don't want that past behavior shaped. But at the same time, I don't think there isn't really a full consensus on the way forward and how they want to move forward with it. I think I've gone over the 2-minute guidelines, so I'll stop there.
A question from Dr. Anton Fedyashin. How do we see the role of, if any, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in shaping regional policy to Afghanistan and shaping developments in Afghanistan? Dr. Yunsun, how would you see the SCO's role, if any?
Sure. Well, FCO in terms of Afghanistan has been having this conversation for quite a few years. So this is not a new phenomenon. But I would say that from the Chinese perspective, there was a strong sense of disbelief that U.S. withdrawal would be imminent. But now China comes to the realization that in terms of regional coordination framework, Shanghai Cooperation Organization is one of the existing platforms that could serve this purpose. But I would also say that there are some differences between China and Russia coming to the future of Afghanistan, and also how the two countries will deal with its relationship with the United States coming to Afghanistan. And I think for interlocutors or observers in Beijing, it is pointed out that China is not yet ready to turn Afghanistan into a competitive battleground with the United States just yet. So, like I said before, I think FCO in terms of counterterrorism and regional security, I think there are a lot of implications there that the Chinese would be willing to look at. But if SCO or the China-Russia cooperation is presenting itself as an alternative or filling the void, if you will, to present a competitive presence with what the U.S. has had before, I don't think that's what the Chinese will be willing to lead the organization to. But then again, earlier in August, China and Russia had a joint military exercise in China's Ningxia province. And both sides made it very clear that this exercise is targeted, is in preparation for any potential fallout or security crisis in Afghanistan. So I think from that perspective, SCO will be relied upon. But again, I think it depends on how the situation in Afghanistan will evolve. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A question from Patricia Salisbury about an extremely important issue that we haven't covered yet, which is opium production and heroin trade. Now, of course, this is not such a critical issue for the United States, but it is very important indeed for Europe, including Britain, for Russia, for Iran, which has not merely suffered tremendously from Afghan heroin, but has also lost thousands of border guards in the struggle against it, and for Pakistan. So she cites Pino Arlachi, who was the director of the United Nations Office of Drugs in 1997 to 2001, when, of course, the Afghan Taliban cracked down very successfully on the heroin trade in the hope of international recognition. And she quotes Dr. Arlachi as saying that the only way out now is an ambitious recovery plan based on the development of Afghanistan's domestic resources in order to lead to a new suppression of the heroin trade by the Taliban. And he wrote that such a program does not have to be expensive. It basically just involves existing levels of international aid to Afghanistan, but replacing present levels of military aid with civilian development aid. The Taliban have, of course, promised to do this in every capital where they have been, as well as in Doha. But how do you see, would you favor such an approach to the Taliban? In other words, making international aid linked above all to the suppression of the heroin trade rather than other issues, and essentially continuing it at this level for that purpose. Perhaps, I don't know, Dr. Samad, would you like to address that first?
I will, thank you. Let me, before I answer the question directly, let me say that the one element that is going to also be critical, looking at their history, looking at the way they engage and the way they decide, whether it's on aid, whether it's on economics, or whether it's on trade, or whether it's on counterterrorism, or any of these issues, is the Taliban themselves. Others have all the tools and all the resources at their disposal. I think Afghan history has shown, and the Taliban history has shown, that they are a very key player in all of this, whether we like it or not. And they will be part of the decision-making process that will be involved. We saw this with the Americans over the last 3 years. The Taliban, from what I know, gave the Americans a hard time through negotiations. Coming back to drugs. Yes, on one hand, the Taliban have a clear position that they want to ban. They have already actually announced a ban as well as on cultivation and production and trade of narcotics. But they also understand, they're very, they're astute enough to understand that there's a timing issue, there's a transition issue, there's a governance issue, there's an alternative livelihood issue, and there is a cooperation, regional and international issue involved. And at the end of the day, there is a population that will starve and will be bankrupt if it is weaned immediately through force, as we saw. You all know the numbers. I think the United States alone spent $8 billion in counter narcotics and failed over the past few years. The UK had the lead for many years and failed. There are all kinds of theories as to why or why not, and I won't get into that because then it gets us into conspiracy theories. But the region is the immediate victim of this, as you mentioned earlier. And then it goes all the way to not just Europe, but even Canada. And I think that it's an international issue. So I think that the Taliban are, from what I have seen and heard and read, the Taliban want to link the drugs issue to economic assistance, but mostly to investment. So you're going to see a push by the Taliban to attract investment. They're not going to get Western investment initially. So this is why they are focused on the region. They're focused on countries like China and maybe even Pakistan and Turkey and Qatar and others. And so I think that there's a linkage that you're going to see develop over time by the Taliban themselves between foreign investment, direct investment, private investment as well, in Afghanistan's mainly mineral sector. And so that transition from a drug-dependent economy to some extent to a licit economy is going to be interesting. The other thing that the question that is going to come up with the Taliban on narcotics is whether the current Afghan narcotics production can be turned from illicit to licit. And how long would that take? Because we all know that there's a demand for opium across the board for the pharmaceutical industry, and there is that option available. And if the Taliban are able to control and manage and make sure that they can that the mafias can be weaned of this, which is very difficult because they've been entrenched for all these years, then I think there is another option to take. That's going to take time, and it's not going to be easy, but it is an option that the Taliban would have to consider.
That's a very important point. And I might add that if you look at the history of successful anti-heroin campaigns by Thailand and Turkey and a few other countries, the two absolute keys are to have a sufficiently honest and effective state, because otherwise, of course, the whole thing just collapses in corruption and illicit trade, but also above all, a state which can control the countryside. And that will be a fundamental test of Taliban governance in future, whether they can do this once again. Another question on a critical issue from Elizabeth Block. It's been suggested that other countries had better keep the Afghan people from starving, because otherwise there will be another flood of Afghan refugees. Zahid, you come from Pakistan, the country to which a large majority of Afghan refugees have fled in the past. How great do you see the possibility or likelihood of another huge flight of Afghan refugees from Afghanistan? I mean, obviously, we've seen very considerable numbers trying to leave immediately via Kabul airport, but is this going to be a really serious challenge for Pakistan and the region in future, do you think, or not?
Well, one thing which has not been much talked about by the Western countries is that Afghanistan is on the brink of a human catastrophe. I mean, like the situation, I was reading UNHCR report. About more than 250,000 people, Afghans, have been displaced, internally displaced, for the last 6 months alone. And the situation has gotten worse in terms of the number of people who are now living in below poverty line. Only in 1 year, there has been 10% increase in the number of Afghan population now living under below the poverty line, from 62% to 72%. And also, actually, 92% of Afghans are living or surviving on $2 per day. So that could be this enormity of the problem, we understood. At the moment, actually, the major flux of the more people are trying to get out of the Afghanistan are more educated people for economic reasons, and also actually the fear of retribution. And that's what we've seen actually going towards West. The number of people who have been airlifted by United States and other countries. But as far as Pakistan is concerned, we have seen in the past too, there has been constant flow of refugees from Afghanistan. We are not talking just about what happened in 1980s, and millions of Afghans came to Pakistan. But later on too, actually there has been a constant flow of refugees because of the economic reason, and because in certain areas, because of the conflict. Now, this time, actually, there was a fear that there will be a massive influx of refugees. But I think probably because there has not been much of fighting in those areas in the neighborhood of Pakistan, like, for example, southern Afghanistan and eastern Afghanistan. So that actually, we have not seen a major inflow of refugees at the moment who are fleeing from the conflict. But given the economic situation, and which I have just mentioned, there's the fear that there will be more refugees will be coming. And so that is one of the concerns of Pakistan and maybe other regional countries. And at the moment, Pakistan's dilemma is, on the one side, they're saying that we are not actually take refugees as such, as they did actually in 1980s. There's still 3 million Afghan refugees living in Pakistan. And so they wanted to set some camps around the border area. But so far, actually, we have not seen a major influx of refugees in Pakistan. But later on, one can say that could happen.
A very good question, perhaps a final one from Stanley Kober. Are we spending too much time discussing government reactions as opposed to popular ones? Isn't the major impact of the Taliban's triumph on the mentality and perceptions of the people who live in the region? Perhaps one might say more widely as well. Quite, because it's often been said that the victory of the Afghan Mujahideen over the Soviet Union gave a tremendous moral impetus to Islamist sentiment across large parts of the world among immigrant communities in the West, as well as in the Middle East and elsewhere. Is that something we're likely to see again, that Muslim movements, whether one calls them radical or in some cases movements of resistance, will feel tremendously morally boosted by what has happened in Afghanistan? I don't know who would like to respond to that.
Yes, sorry, can I?
Go ahead, and then
I don't know about other countries, but certainly it will have a huge impact in Pakistan because Taliban, as we discussed earlier, mostly actually reorganized from Pakistani side, and they had a close links with Pakistani religious groups, major political group, and also actually militant organization like Pakistan Tehreek-e-Taliban, which is called TTP. So all that it has actually giving a sense of jubilation in Pakistan, and Islamists feel that it is a victory for jihad. And Pakistan, we have seen that for last several years they have become center of militancy and terrorism. Thousands of people have been killed in Pakistan. So I think probably we see that across the line, it will give a huge impetus to Islamic movements in Pakistan. And it's not just about the militant organization like TTP, or the sectarian organization like Lashkar-e-Jhang, but also actually to the extremism. Pakistan is facing a problem of extremism. So all those things, I think, Taliban victory will be seen as, it's the jihad has won, and they can also enforce the same kind of system in Pakistan. Whether they can do it or not, that's a totally different thing.
Dr. Yunsun, is this something that will worry Beijing, do you think?
Well, I would say for this time around, not really. When you look at the Chinese public opinion about Taliban and its victory, is I would say shockingly positive. That the Chinese netizens are calling this the victory of people's war. That the Taliban was able to win because it had enjoyed the support from the grassroots level and from the people. And I think a lot of this is viewed through the lens of U.S. failure in Afghanistan. As we know, because of the great power competition between U.S. and China, the Chinese would like to portray the failure of the United States in contrast to the victory of Taliban. And as a result of this narrative, we're seeing the Chinese public opinion turning extremely positive about Taliban. And some would even say that, oh, the Taliban are students of Chairman Mao, and it was able to win this war because it followed some of the thoughts and some of the doctrines that Chairman Mao used to preach. So I would say that the concern about Taliban's religious nature and about its potential religious-related policies are being intentionally ignored in this narrative. And I'm afraid that is part of the byproduct of the government of a Beijing dictated narrative that has had in the Chinese society. Thank you.
Thank you. Which is, of course, to put it mildly, somewhat paradoxical, given the tremendous fear being generated by the Chinese government of Islamist terrorism, especially with regard to Xinjiang. But I suppose the Chinese government are not alone in the world in pursuing radically incompatible approaches simultaneously, right?
I think these are, well, I agree they seem to be paradoxical, but in reality, I think the Chinese see a more pragmatic way of solving that terrorist concern, which is that if Taliban, like what the panelists have discussed, is indeed interested in economic growth, China is not a dispensable partner in that equation, especially given the financing that China is willing to offer and the infrastructure capacity that China possesses. So I think for China, there are potential ways to solve that, maybe not solve, but to mitigate the terrorist problem as long as Taliban government or Taliban-led government is pragmatic enough. So I think the Chinese see the economic leverage there as important. And on the other hand, this narrative of the US failure versus Taliban's victory, I think is more important coming to the political calculation for Beijing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm afraid that is all we have time for. This is the end of the panel. I apologize very much to those members of the audience whose questions I haven't been able to ask, obviously for reasons of limited time. I would just like to remind everyone again of our panels on Friday, series of panels, the 9/11 wars, looking back, moving forward. I hope that you will be able to attend these, or as much of them as possible. And I would like to thank all the panelists very much for a truly interesting panel about a dimension of the Afghan conflict, which I'm afraid in the United States and the West was terribly neglected for far too long, which is the responses, the policies, the interests of those countries which live next to Afghanistan and always will, in a way that we don't and never will. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to continuing our discussions on a future occasion. And many thanks to all the members of the audience for coming. Goodbye.